That is the function of the statement, and there's all room for that. And I don't think one should always be, as I've said in this podcast before, I think politeness is useful for a conversation, useful for persuasion, but it shouldn't be upheld as the only legitimate form of political comment. But I think if we focus on what Stewart was saying there, which is, well, how do we actually persuade people? How do I convince somebody I meet on the street, in the pub, about the position that they're holding, or their uncertainty ought to fall down in a pro-independence perspective? I think you'd find very few people that would be persuaded by saying that the long-term history of the Labour Party is one of terrible betrayal and failure. I mean, there's an argument for that, but I think it's often quite beneficial to treat these things to approach people respectfully with their concerns and treat them seriously, because of course they'll be held seriously. So I might think you're a numpty, but if you're a numpty with concerns, then I'm not going to get you to vote for me by just coming out and saying you're a moron. So I think there's something in what the kind of positive story that Stephen Noon is saying, though. I think also the no campaign are going to win any negative campaign because they're just much better at it.
They are very committed to that course.
Haven't they got Obama's people?
They're using a technology platform that was used by the Democrats. We've got something very similar.
It's just something someone mentioned to me, that they've got some of the Obama people, and they just basically decided, like, Obama, his campaign, they just decided to go for Romney before Romney went for them, and they just did it the whole time.
But what you were just saying there, Michael, is a point that was made in the context of the American election, that Obama released his attack dogs and attempted to cement in the mind of the electorate very early on, in some accounts of the campaign anyway, that he was a kind of dubious, a trimmer, a rich man, louche, indifferent to the average punter. And the argument was that partly why Obama succeeded was that it wasn't possible for the Republicans subsequently, not least because Romney is many of these things, to overcome that image of him. So if that is indeed the kind of Better Together campaign policy, then it must be an attempt to create very early on in this campaign an image that fundamentally independence is just, very uncertain, very scary, very risky, and to ensure that sticks, and therefore even all of the best positive statements that might emanate from Stewart and emanate from Stephen Noon and all of the other campaigners cannot overcome that fundamental idea that, awful dangerous, this independence malarkey.
Yeah, you see some strange things. There was some tweets, some people put compilations of tweets together, and there was one going like, what sort of arsehole would vote for independence? And you think, good grief.
But it's a question about mutual comprehension, isn't it? I mean, I think that's the kind of root of what Stewart was saying, that fundamentally, in order to reach that magic 50-something% at the very least for the Yes campaign, we're going to have to persuade people to vote for independents who have previously voted for the Labour Party, who have previously believed that the Union was the best political model, because, as we know, none of the polling has shown an innate majority for independence. So we're going to have to persuade people who hold views which aren't the same as us. And I think actually it's one of the more worrying aspects, or things that one might perceive in some of the pro-independence rhetoric you hear from some quarters. It's almost as if we've won already. It is a self-evident proposition that independence is the best, the good, the beautiful, and anyone that doesn't really agree with you is just absolutely out of their tree. And I think that's insane. I mean, given where we're at in the poll, that sensibility is totally wrong and absolutely fatal. If we approach this campaign believing that all decent, true, and Scots already believe the proposition, then we're absolutely stuffed.
What do you think on the idea that now there's more of a conversation in the media, as well as the constant kind of negativity? There's been more and more discussion of what if, not only with the negative sensibility, but actually how, instead of just this would be a disaster, there's more conversation now about how would this go, how would the negotiations work. Do you think that's a positive or a negative for the campaign, Stuart? I think it's a positive thing.
It's definitely a positive thing. I mean, we love it when people ask us questions. We love it when people discuss the realities of it, because it means that people are beginning to think about it. And they've moved past that initial instinctive reaction to go, change equals risk. And we're trying to, every time someone asks a question, every time says, well, what about this, or what about that, and how would that work? You're beginning to move into an understanding that the change we're talking about is an opportunity. and a lot of our digital strategy is around give us your questions, send us your questions. If you're undecided, we want to hear from you, and we get back to people personally with emails tailored to them, saying, look, you asked about this, this, and this. Here are your answers.
How much dialogue are you having? Do you get a lot of contact? Is it quite heavy?
We do. Yeah, we do get a lot of contact. We have a section on the website where we ask people more generally from any quarter for questions. We get an awful lot of questions from actually across the spectrum, people who profoundly disagree with us and maybe think they're going to try and make a point, and then we go back to them and say, well, have you thought about this? And they'll respond in a way that suggests that we haven't converted them, but we've made them think a wee bit about our position. We get questions from undecideds from several things we're running at the moment, and that's really useful for us because it engages us with the issues that actually matter to them, and that's not always the same as what's portrayed in the media. And then we get the other important constituency is people who are in favour of independence but are wanting facts and wanting arguments and wanting the tools to engage in a conversation with their friends and family. And that's where we're going to win, because we are genuinely a grassroots campaign. We've genuinely got tens of thousands of people out there right now discussing this with the people around them and making them think about it.
Something to think about that happened this week, we'll move on to our last topic now. Something to think about that happened this week is the rise of the flower pot men. Which may be an obscure reference in case you don't understand what I'm talking about. There was a photo of a UKIP member this week who was doing a Nazi salute, or maybe he wasn't. I understand that a photo can be taken at an inopportune moment, and there's photos of Obama like that.
Or he's reaching for his mobile phone.
Yeah. Oh, no, I saw another excuse that he was trying...
Explanation, Michael, explanation.
Oh, sorry. I saw another explanation that what he was actually doing was telling the women not to take a photo of the pot plant, which is why I mentioned that, which seems a rather strange explanation to me. But yeah, do you think this is an extremely worrying development? Like, I've always found it's one of the political certainties in life that sooner or later someone from UKIP's going to say something mad. But now that they're actually beginning to gain seats and some influence, where does this leave, first of all, England? You're living down there, Andrew, and then the independence campaign, because although sure you're talking about emphasising the positives and so on, there's been a lot of talk that this emphasises the different directions which Scotland and England wish to go. Now, I know Andrew's quite sceptical about this idea of you can take for granted that Scotland's more to the left than England. I'm not necessarily convinced of it myself, but does it show that we're moving in different directions? I think we'll start with Andrew there.
Yes, well, there we are. They moved up, I think, from about 8 seats in county councils in England to, I think, 147 or something like that. So obviously it's in institutional terms, it's an upward march for UKIP. None in Oxfordshire, where I live, though the Conservative majority were deprived by 1 seat of their overall control of Oxfordshire County Council. What does it mean for independence? Well, I think there are a few folk which I think are rightly arguing that it shouldn't be too complacently accepted that Scotland is a land of progressive milk, honey and redistribution, because it clearly ain't. Clearly isn't the case. But equally, I think that could take on a rather absurd perspective where you begin to say that, well, actually, despite all of the evidence, despite the fact that UKIP couldn't win a seat in Scotland, and despite the fact that they've won over 100 and almost 150 seats in England, that's of no significance. Obviously, it's very significant. I tend to agree with Alex Massey's diagnosis of this in a couple of pieces that he put out this week, which was about the fact that UKIP's triumph in the county council elections will probably be felt most pronouncedly in our politics via how the Conservative Party, particularly in England and Wales, reacts to it. Does it see the rise of UKIP as a call to itself to become more like UKIP? And if they do that, what the devil that will do to their rhetoric, I have no idea. But I think Alex is right about that. I think that UKIP might maybe take an occasional seat in the House of Commons in the next election if we're still part of the UK at that point. But fundamentally, it pulls other parties more towards their perspective, and therefore it has challenges as well for the Labour Party, as challenges for the kind of where the mainstream, I suppose, of UK politics sits. And that's why I tend to think that people who say that the rise of UKIP is a good thing for the left across the UK are mistaken, because that argument contends that the UKIP will split the right vote and therefore will deprive the Conservative Party of government. I don't think that's right. I think it pulls the Labour Party to the right. I think it pulls the Tories to the right. And there's Nigel Farage grinning for all he's worth, because he's actually, in a funny way, has achieved something through his 147 councillors and no members of Parliament. And that's what I think is the most worrying about it, that it might move the middle of UK politics in a yet more dismal direction.
The thing is, I agree with you that it's going to move everything to the right. There's another thing that, would it be possible that if it did sort of split the right vote, then they would just go in coalition with the Tories? Would the Tories be totally averse to that? They can say, yeah, we think they're loons and stuff, but if push came to shove and it meant them staying in power, would they involve them in the coalition? And speaking of coalitions, that's the other interesting point of this. Have the UKIP benefited from, there was always a protest vote for the Liberals, and to a certain extent the British National Party, and have UKIP benefited from the loss of both of those protest votes? I'll come back to Andrew on that again, I think.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I mean, I live in Oxfordshire. I live in the north part of town, and it's quite an affluent corner of territory where people would never dream of voting for the Labour Party because they're terrible snobs, but would instead vote for the Liberal Democrats because they feel they have some thin social conscience, but don't want to be too left and don't want to forgo the BMW and the expensive house in which they live. My perception is that in Scotland we rather misconstrue the nature of English support for Liberal Democrats. I think it may be the case that Nick Clegg is in trouble in Sheffield, but in places like North Oxford, I tell you, the Lib Dems are doing well. In my seat, in my division, the Lib Dem took 50% of the vote, and I dare say actually they'll stick with the Liberal Democrats into the next parliamentary election too. So I wonder if there's an extent to which we can expect the Lib Dems to be quite sturdy in these kind of corners of the southeast of England where their main competitors are the Conservative Party. And it's important to remember that. And your Charlie Kennedys aren't in your kind of more social democratic tradition as we find in many of our Scottish Liberal Democrat representatives. As to coalitions, well, I think it remains to be seen whether UKIP is able to translate its current gains into substantial parliamentary support in Westminster. That said, we are in a hung parliament now, and there's every likelihood we're going to have a hung parliament after 2016. So even a stray crew, even a small motley collection of lucky UKIppers, if they manage to seize a seat or two, might be able to wield influence. I think that's just a sort of self-evident statement about our political situation at the moment in the UK.
And Stuart, what do you make of the rise of the UKIP? Just generally, what it means for England, and also what does it mean for the Yes campaign?
I think what it means for England is what Andrew's been saying about centre balance. It comes at a time when the Conservative Party is far from at ease with itself, and that the Tories will be tempted to tack to the right. The other interesting part of it, though, is yes, it's a protest vote. I doubt very much that it will translate into much in the way of Westminster influence after the next UK general election. The question I would be asking myself if I was a Labour strategist is why did that protest vote not come harder towards Labour? I was reading an independent blog by John Rentoul that actually Labour's share of the vote was down about 9% year on year. The Tories was down 6%. So actually, it's been a pretty poor result for Labour. That's with my political trainspotting hat on. What does Nigel Farage's electoral success mean for us up here? We have a narrative about the difference between Scottish politics and Westminster politics, and that's much more around how Scotland's representatives of Westminster have voted on key issues like the bedroom tax, where we found situations Scotland's voted against it and we've had it imposed on us. That really is the narrative for us. We aren't basing the argument for independence around the electoral fortunes and misfortunes of parties down south. The case for independent Scotland is just as compelling if Labour are in Westminster as if the Conservatives or a Conservative/UKIP coalition were in Westminster.
I mean, obviously you think that's convincing, Stuart, but do you think many people would regard that as convincing? I mean, I know the argument is it's about power, it's about you getting to decide. You're absolutely able to determine who your representatives are, and those representatives will make choices about whether you have a bedroom tax, whether